how do we practice and embody compassion? And what is compassion at its roots, in its depths? These are some of the questions I'm excited to explore with Dr. Larry Ward, an extraordinary Dharma teacher and the author of America's Racial Karma. I am Thomas Hitoshi Pruiksma, and I have spent the last 5 years, give or take 15, working on a translation of the classical Tamil masterpiece on ethics, power, and love, the Kural, or in short, the Kural. And because this is a work which speaks so profoundly to how we practice and embody wisdom in the nitty-gritty of everyday life, I have been inviting teachers and spiritual leaders and poets and translators into conversations, into Kural conversations, in which we explore 1 or 2 or 3 verses from this work to see how relevant and how nourishing these verses can be for our spiritual practice and for the work and joy of being fully human in a more than human world. I am delighted today to be in conversation with Dr. Larry Ward. He is a senior Dharma teacher ordained by the peace activist and Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh, with his wife, also an ordained senior Dharma teacher, Dr. Peggy Rowe Ward. They together founded the Lotus Institute, which has a wealth of resources for deepening one's practice profoundly. There is also the author, as I've mentioned, of America's Racial Karma, which came out in 2020, and for me was one of the great lights of 2020, a deeply healing, a deeply compassionate, and a deeply relevant book, one that I have just had the great pleasure of rereading and allowing to contribute to my own practice. So I'm very grateful to be able to introduce to you, if you don't know him already, Dr. Larry Ward.
Thank you, Tom. Pleasure to be with you.
Really a great pleasure to have you here. How these conversations have been going is that I've shared, in this case, I've shared with Larry the chapter on compassion. The Kural is a book which contains 133 chapters, each on some specific topic. And the chapter on compassion has 10 verses on the topic of compassion. And this word that the poet uses to speak of compassion can be translated literally as eyes that are moved. And so I've shared this chapter with Dr. Ward, and I'd like to invite him to reflect on, or to ask if were there any verses or any verse in particular that stood out to you when you looked at this chapter.
Well, the first thing I would say is that I felt as if I was being held in a most beautiful way by unseen arms as I went through these verses. And it was, I really appreciated its emotional quality that it had for me, which was a little bit surprising in a pleasant way. And I think the first verse is really what sounds a little strange, moved me the most, because I've been learning how to train my eyes to look at people and the world with openness. And the experience of learning to do that is a moving experience. It's an opening experience of both mind and heart. My most recent practice of doing this is learning to look at every person I meet and seeing their baby face, seeing their youngest face, seeing their innocent face. And I've learned to do the same with plants and animals. And so my wife says, now I'm smitten by everything. And I talk to plants and birds, and anyway, it's an equality of aliveness that compassion has in terms of feeling like I am in touch with what is within me and around me. And everything that I love about this first verse, but the whole 10, but is that it helps me recognize that I have eyes inside. So that for some of my friends who have a great friend here in Kural who is blind, but I've never met a person more compassionate. So his inner eyes are deeply awakened. He's a therapist here, but and so that brings me joy to know that's possible, and that my eyes are just outside of me, but my eyes are also inside of me.
That's so beautiful. I'll share the first verse for
Wonderful.
those who are listening, and I'll share it in English and then in the Tamil so you can hear something of the original language, and then I'll do the English again so we can all hear the verse, including myself, afresh, because it is to me an astonishingly fresh verse. This is how Thiruvallur speaks about how he opens the chapter on compassion. The astonishing beauty of eyes that are moved because it exists. This world exists. கண்ணோட்டும் என்னும் கழிப்பெறும் காரிகை உண்மையான் உண்டிவ்வுலகு. The astonishing beauty of eyes that are moved because it exists. This world exists. And I'll have to say that this is a verse that has moved me, and moved me for a long time because of how deeply it reminds us that the very existence of this earth, this world, depends on compassion. Because compassion is, we are. I mean, how the stakes could hardly be any higher.
That's correct.
And there is very much a sense in which this sight that Thiruvallur is describing is the eye of the heart, the capacity to see beyond appearances, beyond what we might our first impressions might be of someone who stands before us. And in fact, I already know that from this conversation, I will be taking the inspiration to see if I can see more clearly the baby face of each person in front of me, and the young face of the animals and the plants around me, because to see that is to enter into relatedness and relationship with the unseen heart that we nonetheless get to glimpse through another's eyes. Very, very beautiful and profound.
So I find it opening the door to the mystic dimension. And part of the power of these verses for me is that it's done so simply, so clearly. It's almost inescapable if you take it seriously. It given me new images of how I might do poetry in the future, as opposed to how I'm doing it now and have done it in the past. And so I found it inspirational, both in terms of its form, but especially in terms of its simple clarity. It's very easy to, from an academic point of view, get carried away with words. And so I could feel the earth in the language, the groundedness of the author in the words. So I could feel that in my body. And so I really appreciated the kinesthetic sense I had as I went through the poetry. It was an embodied experience for me, not an intellectual one.
That's so beautiful to hear. I very strongly believe that one of the things that that poetry and a poet such as this one offers us is as a deeply embodied experience of language, which does not speak merely to our intellect, although of course it does,
Right.
but it speaks even more deeply to our heart and to our bones, to the earthly matter of our being. And especially Thiruvalluvar, who has such a keen interest in what does it mean to be earthly creatures. For example, the first chapter of the entire work is a chapter in praise of the gods, which is part of the larger civilizational tradition that the poet comes from. And the second chapter is about the glory of rain.
Yeah.
So from the very beginning, he is reminding us of our earth, not just our earthly existence, but its connection to the heavens and to what comes to us from the heavens and what nourishes the earth beneath our feet. And in this very compact verse form, something that has struck me and has struck me even more deeply in these conversations that I've been quite blessed to be having with people, is that this very compact verse form contains what I experience as a kind of infinite space. 5 words, 6 words, 7 words, and somehow the whole of our precious human existence and more than human existence comes to life. I'd be curious to hear if there were other verses in particular from the chapter that stood out to you, or that you found in sort of a conversation with the first verse, or what else spoke to you?
Well, I really also was moved by the rain. I really appreciated you sending the introduction, which is beautifully done. And the verses on the rain reminded me so much of actually Thich Nhat Hanh's first book on the miracle of mindfulness and what it means to behold in the moment, the miracle of being alive and the miracle of everything around you, both seen and unseen, but also the miracle of being nurtured, fed, taken care of by the universe. And so with the rain, I could feel both the heaven and the earth in a kind of symphony. And here we are in the middle of it. And so gratitude was what came up in me as I especially went through the rain verses. So they were just tremendous. I really could, there's a phrase in Buddhism of dharma rain. So I felt like I was being rained on in the best possible way.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I don't know if you can hear it, but there's actually a very light rain coming down here. So
really?
you may hear a bit of the rain here, which, I'll have to say that as I worked on the second chapter on rain, I was that phrase from Thich Nhat Hanh of the Dharma rain, that image of Dharma as rain, was nourishing this translation. And that I think, another thing I think that makes the entire work so really extraordinary is that it is so open to deep traditions of many kinds, so that I can read the book as a kind of a guide to the practice of mindfulness, as much as a book which resonates with Hindu tradition and with Jain tradition. And Christian missionaries in India resonated with the book as a kind of Christian text. And I have friends who are Sufis, and I can hear the resonance of Sufi teachings, for instance, in the work, because it is so compassionately open to the rain, to the rain and all of the forms that the rain takes. I also have to note how beautiful it is that you mentioned the miracle of mindfulness, because one of the great surprises and delights for me is that the press that published the English translation of Miracle of Mindfulness, Beacon Press, is the same press that is bringing out this translation of the Kural, and I'm particularly grateful to them for bringing this kind of work to the forefront and to the conversation that we get to have in our wider world. It occurs to me it might be interesting to share one of the verses from Rain.
Sure.
In fact, one of the very first verses from the Kural that I sort of fell in love with is a verse that I find very difficult to translate, and I think I've only partially succeeded because the verse has within it the sound of rain. And I'll do the Tamil first this time so you can
Okay.
hear what it sounds
All
like.
right.
Tupparka tuppaya tuppaki, tupparka tuppaya dumarai, which I've translated as making food fit for feeding, and itself food that feeds, rain. Tupparka tuppaya tuppaki, tupparka tuppaya dumarai. And you can hear the rain and the playfulness of this poet, but also the way in which, he reminds us that rain in our earthly existence is not simply what makes all other food possible, but is itself a nourishment, is itself a food. One could sit with that for, a decade and still be learning.
Yes. Well, I find all these verses that I've had a chance to look at a little bit is as almost portals, entry points into our depths, without excluding the mundane. And I think that's part of what makes it so adaptable in one sense, in the best sense of the word adaptation, whether it's in Sufism or Jainism or Hinduism or Buddhism or Christian or et cetera. But it's like I entered into this space to receive, where I recognized I could receive the wisdom that was there. And so for me, back to compassion, for me, the key word for compassion is openness. Open to life, including my own, but open to all the life around me, both visible and invisible. And so there was a kind of gratitude, gratefulness, that this was expressed in this way. So I feel blessed for having the invitation, for having a chance to, I looked, of course, I'm kind of neurotic about looking up history. I looked up and looked online, printed this, printed that, and it's a treasure that I'll carry with me, both in print and in body.
So beautiful. There's one last verse that occurs to me because it's so pertinent to what you just said that perhaps from my end can be a kind of closure. It's from the chapter on having kindness. And it has to do with openness. And Thiruvalluvar says, and again, this is the first verse of this particular chapter, he says, from openness to all people, the practice of kindness comes easily. And so when you were speaking, Larry, at the beginning of our conversation about openness to all people, I get to hear the voice of Dr. Larry Ward and the voice of the poet Thiruvalluvar, and the voice of the poet Thiruvalluvar and the voice of Dr. Larry Ward, and to hear how we all are, as Thich Nhat Hanh reminds us, we inter-are with each other. We participate in a glorious form of interbeing. I'm so very grateful to have had this opportunity to speak with you about these verses. For those of you who are interested in learning more about Larry's work, I would urge you to visit lotusinstitute.org. I'll put a link in the description and we'll display it for people to read. I've had the honor of knowing Larry for, I think, for more than 6 years, and for learning with and from him into this very moment, this very precious moment. And so to close, if there's any last thoughts you want to offer or any questions you might have for me as a translator, Larry, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Well, one thing I want you to know, I'm starting to put together a poetry dialogue with my son. And so I was sharing this tradition with him. And so part of what we hope to do next year, as once I'm over some dental medical stuff, is to spotlight some of the great poets around the world from different cultures and places, mixed with our own individual poetic work and popular lyrics, which some people don't know where they came from. And he was telling me a wonderful story about a friend of his who thought this new song was so very cool. My son said, that was Marvin Gaye. That's where the lyrics came from. So lyrics are not bound by time. Poetry is emptiness in the sense of it's non-local in terms of its capacity to reach us wherever we may be. And so it's my privilege to be with you. Best for the book.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who's listened. And may all beings thrive.
Yes. Take good care.
You too.
All righty.